Though the work is hard, the income is decent. I have always liked the sea. Well, I once loved it. I'm not sure exactly anymore now. Last month, what happened to me? It's altered everything. Based in Houston, Texas, I am employed with Ocean Tech Solutions. On Gulf of Mexico oil platforms and underwater pipelines, we labor extensively. Though we have all the finest tools and are well trained, this is a perilous job. That is at least what I used to believe. It all began when we signed a contract to fix some pipeline damage roughly 100 miles off Louisiana's coast. If it is important, the coordinates were 28 degree 17.3 N, 89 degree 845.2. We were advised it was only regular maintenance, nothing we had done 100 times before. On Monday morning, our 4-person crew loaded the support ship, the Sea Breeze. There was me, Chris, our manager Mark, and Tyler, the new guy. The weather was nice, and as we headed off, everyone was in great spirits. We arrived at the spot in around 6 hours. We began our regular getting ready as we arrived, examining tools, reviewing the schedule, that kind of thing. Everything appeared to be in line. Chris and I were scheduled to go down first, evaluate the damage, and begin the repairs. Tyler would watch from the ship, learning the ropes for this employment. Mark would be ready to descend should we require more hands and coordinate from above. Chris pushed me as we dressed in our diving gear. "Hey Jake, you hear about the weird stuff some of the fishing boats have been reporting in this area?" I let my eyes roll back. Chris was always drawn to that sort of material. "Let me project, mermaids?" He burst out laughing. "Nah, man. They're saying they have seen unusual lights under the water, and some of them swear their sonar's been picking up something big moving down there." Not much paying attention when I checked my oxygen levels, I said, "Probably just a whale." Chris said, "Maybe," shrugging. "But don't whales normally stay closer to the surface?" Mark drew me over for a last briefing before I could respond. "Okay, folks, visibility isn't great down there, so stay close to each other and keep in constant communication. If anything feels off, you come right back up, got it?" We nodded, and shortly we were sinking below. The water was black and freezing, our strong lights sliced through the shadows. Deeper we found that familiar pressure gathering around us. No matter how many dives you do, you never truly grow used to it. First, everything appeared okay until we arrived at the pipeline. There was a minor crack, not very significant. We started working, sparks from our welding torches shooting across the sea. After about 1 hour of labor, I observed something strange. Usually all around us when we're down there, the fish were absent. Not a handful, but all of them. It was as though the water had turned empty all at once. I gestured about us and tapped Chris on the shoulder. He nodded, quite obviously seeing the same thing. Over the comms we said nothing either, not wanting to come across as worried over any lost fish. But I felt it then as well, an aquatic vibration. I first assumed it could come from our equipment, but it turned out differently. Greater. It seemed to come from all around us. Chris's voice cracked in my earpiece. "You feel that?" "Sure," I answered. "What do you suppose it is?" Our lights wavered before Chris could respond. "For a time, but down there in that darkness, even a moment without light is horrific." "Mark," I said across the intercom, "we have some equipment problems, lights flitting." Before Mark's voice emerged, twisted by static, there was a stop. "Say again, Jake. You're breaking up." The tremor was growing in strength. Now, like a deep subsonic hum, I could feel it in my chest. I said to Chris, "Something's wrong. We should head upstairs." He nodded. Then we began to climb. We noticed it at that point. A light far off in the night. Unlike our lights, this was not. This had a light bluish hue, pulsating gently. Chris yelled out, "Mark, are there any other submersibles or divers nearby?" More static. Then Mark's fractured voice. No. Other. N. Aria. What E? The light was growing in brightness. Not larger, not at all nearer. And it was not isolated either. Frozen in surprise, more lights showed up as we watched. 12, then 24 surrounded us in a broad circle. "We have to leave here," I murmured, trying to keep my voice cool. "Now." At that instant, I didn't care. We started climbing faster than was safe, most likely. Still there, constantly just at the brink of view, the lights followed us. Our comms buzzed to life once more about halfway toward the surface. "Jake? Chris? Do you copy? What is going on down there?" "Mark," I whispered, short of breath from our quick climb. "We're coming up now, something down here. Lights, moving." "Lights? What do you mean, lights?" "Jake, you're not making sense." I didn't give further explanation any thought. The lights still followed us, almost to the surface. I looked down one more just before we surfaced. Under us, the lights had created a complete circle, throbbing in unison now. And I watched something move in the middle of the circle, something substantial. Screaming for them to get us out, we broke out of the water adjacent to the ship. Confused and anxious, the crew hurried to assist us on board. I turned to Chris right away as my helmet was off. "Tell me you've seen that. Tell me I'm not insane." His face was pallid, his eyes wide. "I noticed, Jake. What the devil was that?" Mark and Tyler were there posing questions, but I couldn't concentrate on what they were saying. All I could focus on was what I had seen in those final submerged seconds. For in the middle of those lights, I believed I saw something just for a moment. Anything that resembled almost exactly a face. The next few hours blurted together. Concerned we might have decompression sickness from our quick climb, Mark asked we be seen by the medic on board. On the physical level, we were great. Mentally, that was another narrative. Chris and I tried to describe what we had seen, but even to our own ears it seemed absurd. Lighting under the sea? A huge form sliding down into the depths? Mark listened politely, but I could see uncertainty in his eyes. "Look," he remarked at last, "I believe that you boys saw something down there. But let's think about this rationally. Could it have been bioluminescent creatures? Maybe a school of fish or squid?" I gave my head a shake. "Mark, you don't understand. These lights were organized. They moved with purpose. And that shape. It was huge, bigger than any fish or squid I have ever heard of." "Quiet up till now," Tyler said up. "Most people write off strange things in the deep as tall stories, but I have heard stories from other divers." Mark chopped him off. "That's enough, Tyler. We don't need to be feeding into this. You two rest. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, we'll go back down. We still have a job to finish." He turned back to Chris and me. "Go back down!" Chris cried out. "Are you nuts after what we saw?" "We have a contract to satisfy," Mark replied decisively. "We have to finish this repair one way or another, even if you really don't feel safe. I'll go down with Jake." Though I wanted to object, I knew Mark was correct. We had stuff to do, and I had never before stopped working, independent of my level of fear. That evening I found it impossible to fall asleep. My eyelids closed, and I saw those lights throbbing in the darkness. Trying to make sense of what we had seen, I kept going back over every instant of the dive in my thoughts. I gave up on sleep about 3 a.m. and headed out on the balcony. Chris was already there, staring out the black lake, surprising me. I asked, following him at the railing, "Can't sleep either?" He gave his head a shake. "Every time I start to fade, I feel like I'm back down there, surrounded." For a moment we stood silently, the only sound the soft lapping of waves on the ship's hull. Chris asked once more at last, "We have to go back down, do we not?" I nodded slowly. Yeah, I think we do. We cannot allow this, whatever it eyes, stop us from doing our job. But if it's still down there, Jake? What if it's waiting for us? For that, I lacked a response. We ready for another dive early the next morning. The atmosphere was underlined by tension. Even Tyler and the crew of the ship, who had not witnessed what we had, appeared on alert. Mark resolved he would come down with us this time, Tyler keeping an eye from above. Mark gave us a pep talk as we started to pack. All right, guys, we're professionals. Whatever you saw yesterday, we'll handle it if we see it again. But our priority is fixing that pipeline. Stay focused on the job. You're spooked. Though I doubt any of us were truly convinced, we nodded. I looked one final time at the surface as we got ready to descend and wondered whether I would see it once more. This water appeared darker and more oppressive. Every shade seemed to be conceivably concealing something. Although we arrived at the pipeline without incident, Chris and Mark seemed to be oozing tension. We worked silently. Our only other source of illumination apart from our headlamps was our welding torches. I would half expect to see those spooky lights once more as I scanned the darkness surrounding us every few minutes. Chris stiffened next to me just as we were almost finished with the repair. "Did you hear that?" His voice cracked across the intercom. "Hear what?" Mark questioned. It sounded like, I don't know, a kind of low hum. Though I strained my ears, all I could hear was our own equipment and breathing. Then I sensed it just as I was ready to inform Chris he was seeing things. That identical resonance from yesterday, so low it was more of a sensation than a sound. "I feel it too," I murmured, my heart picking speed. Mark was searching, his motions tense and erratic. "All right, let us just wrap up here and..." He never completed that last word. Our lights turned off at that very instant, all of them together. We sank into pure, absolute darkness. Chris yelled out in panic, and I reached out aimlessly looking for him. "Chris! Mark, can you hear me?" Their voices returned, warped and devoid of dynamic. "Jake, where are you? I can see nothing." Then a weak light started to show slowly, but our lights were not turning back on. That same faint bluish brightness from before. It was far closer, only this time. My eyes changed and I could see Chris and Mark close by, their figures almost discernible in the poor illumination. And beyond them, all sides of us illuminated, many hundreds of them, perhaps forming a huge round around us. "Oh God," I said to Mark. He whispered, "What's that?" The lights pulsed quicker now than they had ever done, and the water's resonance got greater as they pulsed. My entire body felt as though it were quivering. Then something started to take form right in the middle of the sphere of lights. It first seemed as simply a darker slosh in the shadows. But scared as I looked, it began to crystallize. It was vast, easily our ship's size above, and it was headed at us. Chris cried, his voice quivering with terror, "We have to leave here!" But the lights above us brightened and created a barrier as we turned to swim upward. We could not get out. Now the form was more like this. Long, writhing tentacles and a large body were clear to me. Plus eyes. Many eyes shining the same faint light as the tiny orbs all around us. There is no way this could be real. There were not creatures like this. They could not exist. Still, right in front of us, here was it. That this creature was going to consume us whole. Something odd happened just when I felt it was all over. The thing came to a stop. Every one of those eyes concentrated on us, and I felt everything. Nor a sound, nor a movement, but rather a presence in my head. Though everything was odd and inexplicable, I sensed one thing. It was interesting. We floated there face to face with something that shouldn't exist for what felt like hours but was most likely only minutes. It seemed as though it was learning about us, and in return, impossible information poured into my head. Views of the depths of creatures buried for millions of years, of a planet under the waters we had never dreamed of. Then the monster started to withdraw as quickly as it had shown. The shaking dropped as the lights darkened. Our thoughts whirling from what we had gone through, we were left drifting in darkness once more. Our lights flicked back to life gradually. We stared at one another. All three of us were pale and shakeable. We started our climb toward the surface silently. None of us wanted to spend still another second below those depths. We asked many of questions when we arrived at the cruise. For more than an hour, Tyler and the team had not communicated with us at all. They were almost ready to send down a rescue squad when we surfaced. When we tried to convey what had happened, the words seemed insufficient. How would we characterize something so much beyond our grasp? Mark, who had been so dubious earlier, was now as rocked as Chris and myself were. "We have to report this," he insisted repeatedly. "The company, the government, someone needs to know what's down below." But uncertainty crept in after the first shock subsided. Who would come to believe us? We lacked photographs and proof. For the length of our meeting, our head cameras had inexplicably broken and displayed only still images. To the rest of the globe, it would sound like a fanciful narrative, the kind of story intoxicated sailors share in bars. Ultimately, we agreed to keep it to ourselves, at least for now. We completed our term, working solely during daylight and never alone. Every dive following that was anxious, our eyes searched the water for any indication of those lights all the time. Still, we never saw them again. Life tried to resume after we got back to land. Nevertheless, how could it? We had seen something that fundamentally altered our knowledge of the seas, our planet, the memory of those eyes. That alien presence in our brains tormented our nightmares. Chris left his position 1 week following our return, said he could not stand being in the water anymore. Though I could not force myself to go, I could appreciate his perspective. Something kept latching me back to the sea, to see it once more and need to understand. Since then, I have gone on hundreds of dives, always hoping and worrying about running across that creature once more. I've looked at deep-sea anomalies and contacted other divers with unusual tales. Others have seen things down there, things that don't make sense as well. Nobody other has, however, witnessed anything precisely like what we did. Late at night, I occasionally stare out into the Gulf from the beach close to Galveston, Texas. From here, the water appears to be quite calm and normal. But more recently, I know better. I know there are things beneath those seas in the crushing depths people were never supposed to visit. Old objects, strong stuff, things that have been long before humans and will remain long after we pass go. I don't know whether I will ever see that monster once more. Half of me hopes I do, another half is afraid of that prospect. One thing is certain, though, I won't look at the water the same way ever again. Also, neither should you. Remember this, we have only discovered roughly 5% of the Earth's seas the next time you're at the beach, savoring the sun and the surf. In those dark, pressurized depths. Who knows what is observing us? For over 3 years, I, Sarah, a night shift nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Portland, Oregon, have been working under working evenings has brought me some strange events. Yet nothing could have equipped me for what happened last month. It was Tuesday night, or I suppose Wednesday morning, roughly at 2 a.m. As normally is at that time, the hospital was calm. On my rounds, I was checking on third-floor East Wing patients. Up until I arrived at room 317, everything was normal. Now an old guy called Mr. Johnson occupied room 317. Having been admitted 1 week earlier for pneumonia, he was healing nicely. Quietly opening the door, I didn't want to wake him should he be asleep, but I stopped as soon as I entered. The bed had nothing on it. I first assumed maybe he had visited the bathroom. Sometimes patients get up without seeking for assistance even when they shouldn't. When I examined the little bathroom connected to the room, it was vacant as well. I started to become concerned. Mr. Johnson wasn't in terrific form, and he most certainly shouldn't have been prowling about alone. I heard something behind me just as I was ready to contact security. Coming from the bed was a gentle moan. I turned around and there he was. Mr. Johnson was precisely where he ought to be, lying in bed. I tried to understand what I was seeing by hard blinking. Just seconds earlier, I could have vowed the bed was empty. But there he was, sleeping soundly as he had never done. I aimed to brush it off. Perhaps I simply saw things tiredly. Already, the change had been a protracted one. I proceeded about my regular rounds, noting his vitals on his chart. Everything seemed normal, so I left the room a little uncomfortable, but told myself it was nothing. I was at the nurse's station brushing up on some paperwork around 1 hour later when Jenny, another nurse, approached me. "Hey, Sarah," said she. "Did you move Mr. Johnson to a different room?" I got a cold running down my back. "No," I responded gently. "Why did you ask?" Jenny squinted. "That is strange. I just walked by 317. The bed was unoccupied. Perhaps he had been moved, and we hadn't heard anything yet." I knocked over my coffee, quickly getting up. Pulling Jenny's arm, I murmured, "Come with me." We hurried to room 317, and as I opened the door, I gasped. There was occupancy of the bed. There Mr. Johnson was sleeping peacefully. Jenny seemed perplexed. "But I swear, I obviously witnessed." "I know," I responded, my voice almost above a whisper. "Same thing happened to me earlier." We both paused there, fixed on Mr. Johnson. He exuded such peace and normalcy. Still, something was absolutely quite wrong. To be sure, I decided to once again check his vitals. Mr. Johnson's eyes opened just as I got to the bed. They were foggy and unfocused. He began to mumble something. I bent in to listen to him. "Two sights cannot be, two places." I became chilled. When things grew even more strange, I checked his pulse. His pulse changed in a way I had never seen before. It sped up and slowed down. Beside his bed, the monitor began to blaze fiercely, displaying incomprehensible figures. While I tried to steady Mr. Johnson, Jenny hurried to get a doctor's appointment. But as I worked, I couldn't get rid of the impression that something inconceivable was occurring directly in front of me. Dr. Evans showed up promptly, and we worked through Mr. Johnson's problem over the next hour. In a few short seconds, his vital signs swung rapidly from dangerously low to impossibly high. His body seemed to be unsure about whether it was merely mildly alive or superhumanly healthy. Looking over the readings, Dr. Evans said, "I've never seen anything like this," shaking his head. We decided to put Mr. Johnson under closer observation in the ICU. He reached my arm as we were getting ready to move him. For an elderly man who had been quite ill, his grasp was shockingly robust. With wide-open terror in his eyes, he replied, "It's pulling me. It's pulling me back and forth." "What's dragging on you, Mr. Johnson?" Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked. He said, "The other place," softly, "the vacant space. I cannot remain fixed in one location. It continues to pull me in." His eyes rolled back in his head and he became limp before I could probe what he meant. We hurried him to the ICU, but his words kept coming back to me. My remaining shift passed in a haze of tests and discussions. Not one of the doctors could articulate what Mr. Johnson was experiencing. Although his condition improved considerably in the ICU, his vital signs kept varying in ways that defied medical understanding. I was tired and perplexed when I at last left work at 7 a.m. When I came home, I attempted to fall asleep, but every time I closed my eyes, Mr. Johnson's terrified eyes kept staring back at me. Empty bed. That evening, I arrived for my work in anxious state. I went right to check on Mr. Johnson in the ICU. When I asked the day shift nurse about him, she seemed odd. "Mr. Johnson?" she asked, wrinkling her face. "He does not reside in the ICU. He continues to occupy room." My heart began to pound. I answered, "That's impossible. Last night we shifted him to the ICU." I had been there. Shaking her head, the nurse said, "I'm not sure what to tell Sarah. All day he has been in 317. Actually, Dr. Miller just paid him a quick visit 1 hour ago, said he was performing far better." My head whirling, I virtually rushed to room 317. Mr. Johnson was seated up in bed eating his dinner when I opened the door. As he saw me, he grinned. "Hello, nurse," he said with great enthusiasm. "Wonderful evening, isn't it?" Frozen with surprise, I stood there. There is no such possibility here. That morning, I had visited him in the ICU, barely aware, and attached to 12 machines. He now looked better than he did when he was admitted. I said gently, "Mr. Johnson, do you remember what happened last night?" He was perplexed. "Yesterday night? Not unusual. I slept really peacefully. Lot better today." Looking over his vitals, I found everything to be exactly normal. It was as though the events of yesterday evening had never occurred. I ran across Dr. Evans leaving his room. "Doctor," I began, "about Mr. Johnson. He severed me." "Oh, sure, amazing comeback, isn't I? Pneumonia doesn't clear up like this in my experience. If he continues to improve like this, we most likely will release him tomorrow." Something stopped me even as I opened my mouth to object and explain the ICU and the absurd vital signs. Given no evidence of it, how could I describe what had happened? Even now, would anyone really trust me? The next several evenings were quiet. Mr. Johnson kept getting better until he was let go, as Dr. Evans had advised. I began to doubt whether I had dreamed the whole affair. Perhaps the pressure of night shifts was beginning to affect me more than I had known. Still, it happened once more around a week later. Mrs. Taylor, a middle-aged woman recovering from minor surgery, was our new patient in room 317. During my rounds, I went to see her. When I came upon the vacant bed, my blood stopped cold. Not yet, I considered. It cannot be happening once more. The bathroom was empty when I checked. I heard something behind me just as I was ready to call for aid. Turning, I saw Mrs. Taylor asleep on her bed as though she had never been gone. As I examined her vitals, my hands twitched. Though I couldn't get rid of the anxiety that had crept over me, everything looked natural. I checked room 317 constantly over the evening. Mrs. Taylor occasionally visited. Occasionally, the bed was unoccupied. She seemed flitting in and out of existence. When I tried to discuss it with her while she was waking, she had no understanding what I meant. To her, nothing at all unusual was happening. I realized I had to act to sort out what was happening. But who would find me credible? I had no evidence, no justification for what I was seeing. In my spare time, I began looking for any like cases or theories for what I was going through. I only found nebulous ideas about parallel worlds and quantum physics, which I hardly grasped. Nothing specific. Weeks went by as the trend persisted. Each patient in room 317 seems to go through the same phenomena. Their vital signs would go crazy, they would vanish and then resurface, but they never remembered anything weird. I began to loiter about reporting to work. Every change, I pondered what unachievable dream I would next see. Though something kept me there, I considered leaving and moving to another unit. I thought I had to uncover this riddle to know what was going on in room 317. 2 months or so after it all began, one night I was checking on Mrs. Chen, an elderly patient in 317. Normally the bed was unoccupied when I first arrived. I sighed, then watched for her to come back. But this time something else happened. The air in the room seemed to shimmer as I stood there, like heat waves rising from heated pavement. Mrs. Chen then dimmed gently into view. It was not instantaneous as it was in past years. As if she were being painted into reality just before my eyes, I could really see her figure become firm. I gasped, staggered backwards. Mrs. Chen opened her eyes and briefly they seemed different, older somehow. Equipped with knowledge not fitting the gentle elderly lady I had been looking after. "You see it now," she replied, sounding odd and harsh. "You see the tear." "What tear?" asked with my heart thumping. I asked, "What's happening?" Mrs. Chen grinned, but not her own. It was knowledge from ancient times. "Here," she said, "the veil is thin. This space functions as a bridge, a door that ought not to be open." Her eyelids closed and she seemed to drift back asleep before I could ask what she meant. They were normal when they opened once more a moment later. She lost recall of our chat. I staggered out of the room, my head whirling. Bridge? A door, perhaps? From where? Even now, I don't have responses. Though I have asked to be transferred to another unit, I find myself thinking about room non-stop. About what might lie on the other side of that door. Late at night, occasionally, I find myself standing outside room 317, hand on the doorknob. As yet, I haven't opened it. Not sure I will ever do. But I am aware that whatever is occurring in that room exceeds anything I learned in nursing school. That is thus my narrative. The most unsettling event of my time working nights as a nurse. Nobody is likely to believe me. Usually, I'm not sure I believe it personally most days. I do, however, know what I observed, and I know that door to somewhere else exists in room 317 of Mercy General Hospital. Sometimes that door opens as well. I merely pray that whatever is on the other side stays there, since if it ever chooses to show up, none of us seem ready for that. About 3 years now, I have been employed as a crime scene cleaner. Though most people do not consider this as a job, someone must do it. Someone has to tidy the mess after the cops and investigators are finished. We here come in to help. My employer is Aftermath Specialists in Phoenix, Arizona. From burglaries to, we manage all kinds of crime situations, better or worse, depending on it. Though the work is difficult, I have always been skilled at emotionally separating myself. At least I used to be. 2 months or so ago, this all started. We were called about a work at 1837 West Missouri Avenue. In a decent neighborhood, the house was nice. The kind of location you wouldn't think horrible events could occur. In my field of work, though, you discover that horrible things may happen any place. The cops were just finishing when we got there. In command was Detective Amara Booker. She has been on the force for years. I have worked with her on a number of instances. As we got out of our van, "Hey, Tad," she said. "This one's varied." I arched an eyebrow. "Differed how?" She sighed and ran her forehead over it. "Single victim, male, middle class, 40 seconds. Looks like a suicide, but then I asked. "But something's off. I cannot put my finger on it, just be thorough, okay?" He nodded, familiar to these sort of nebulous police directions. Many times, they exhibited hunches they couldn't explain. My friend Zeke prodded me as we dressed up in our protection suits. What do you suppose she meant by different, he asked. I rolled my shoulders. Who knows? Let us just get in there and do our job. We arrived at the residence, and first it appeared to be a standard suicide scenario. The victim was in the living room, gun on the floor close by. Behind where he must have been seated, the wall showed blood splatters. Zeke and I began working, first eliminating the bigger bits of. Indeed, you know. Though it's not nice, it's part of the employment. I kept having this impression that something was amiss as we worked. Perhaps Detective Booker's comments reached me. "Hey, Zeke," I exclaimed. "Does someone feel weird to you?" Zeke raised his head from his floor scrubbing. "Weird how?" I pointed about the space. "Just weird, like we're being watched or something?" Zeke laughed. "Man, you're allowing that detective to occupy your head. It's just another job." I dismissed it, but the sensation persisted. I noticed something unusual as I was scrubbing the wall. The splash of blood. It did not seem entirely proper. I have witnessed a lot of suicide incidents. Usually the pattern was really clear. This was different somehow. Just when I was ready to bring it up with Zeke, he swore loudly. Turning around, I said, "What's wrong?" Zeke had a pallid face as he gazed down on the floor. "Tad, I swear I just cleaned this spot, but look." I went over and my blood ran cold. Fresh blood stains lay on the hardwood floor there, right where Zeke had been scrubbing minutes ago. I said, That's not possible." Zeke shook his head. "I am telling you, man, I cleaned it. It was gone, and now it is back." We stood there momentarily, just staring at the stain. We then practically all at once returned to work, scouring much more than before. Nevertheless, the discoloration persisted in showing up no matter how much we cleansed. About 1 hour into this, I decided to give Detective Booker a call. This exceeded our regular cleaning assignment. As she responded, "Detective," I added, "we're having some issues here." Her voice tight, she asked, "What kind of issues?" I told about the returning bloodstain and felt a little stupid as I did, right? There had to be a rational justification. On the other end of the line, there was a protracted stop. Then, "I'll be right there. Don't touch anything else until I arrive." Detective Booker studied the stain herself when she arrived. She even witnessed us clean it, just to see it back up minutes later. More to herself than to us. "I've never seen anything like this," she said. I queried, "What do you want us to do?" She considered for a time, then added, "Finish cleaning the rest of the scene. Leave this area for now. I'm going to call in some specialists." We followed her instructions, but I couldn't get rid of the impression that we were overlooking something all along. Something rather significant. I caught sight of a little door in the room's corner as we were packing our tools. It seemed to produce something like a crawl space. "Hey, Detective," I said, "did you people check in there?" She looked where I was pointing and wrinkled. I remember not seeing that before. It wasn't in our first sweep. She went carefully to open the door. It groaned loudly, showing a black area beyond. Detective Booker waved her flashlight inside and then staggered back. Her gasp was, "What the hell?" I approached, gazing into the crawl space. My blood stopped cold at what I witnessed. The little area was bursting with products, images, mementos, bits of apparel, and all of it was blood-coated. "This wasn't here before," Detective Booker replied, her voice trembling a little. "I swear we looked over this house from top to bottom." My hair stood on end as we stood there peering at the horrific collection. Though dim, hardly heard, it was clear. One whispers, The whisper appeared to originate from everywhere and simultaneously from nowhere. Just a quiet hissing sound made my skin crawl. I couldn't make out any words. Glancing at Detective Booker and Zeke, I asked, "Did you hear that?" Their cheeks pallid, they both nodded. Silent for a minute, we strained our ears. Once more the whisper emerged, a little louder this time. Zeke replied, his voice shaking, "We have to leave this here. This is way above our pay scale." Detective Booker gave a headshake. "We cannot leave. This is now an active crime scene. Whatever is going on here, it is obviously more than a simple suicide." Pulling out her phone, she made a call asking for a forensics team and backup. I looked at the crawl space as she spoke. There was something about it that appeared erroneous. Not only of the gory objects within, but also of the room itself. Given the house's measurements, it seemed larger on the inside than it should have been. Detective Booker murmured, "Tad," pulling me out of my reverie. "I need you and Zeke to wait outside. Don't leave the property, but don't return into the house until I say so." Grateful for the chance to get some fresh air, we nodded and left. I inhaled deeply as we emerged to attempt to relax. Leaning against our van, Zeke inquired, "What do you think is going on in there?" I gave my head a shake. "I have never seen anything like it, man. In all my years working this job, we watched for what seemed to be hours. Along with an unidentified van I presumed to contain the forensics team, several police cars showed up. People came and departed from the house, their faces dismal. Detective Booker emerged and spoke to us at last as the sun started to drop. She seemed concerned and worn out. "I need two to come back tomorrow," she added. "We're not done processing the scene, but once we're finished, we'll need your expertise to clean up." "Detective," I stammered, "what's going on in there? What did you find?" She sighed really forcefully. "I can't give you all the details, but it's bad. Worse than we thought. That crawl space is connected to a series of hidden rooms throughout the house. Rooms that logically shouldn't exist given the layout of the house." I got a cold running down my spine. "And the whisper?" she answered. "We're still investigating that." But from her look, I could tell they were as perplexed as we were. That evening, I found it impossible to fall asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that terrible whisper and saw the gory crawl space. I kept considering what Detective Booker had stated regarding rooms that ought not to exist. How could that have been accomplished? Zeke and I went back to the house first thing in morning. Though there were less cops visible, several were still prowling about. Detective Booker welcomed us at the door, her voice low. "Before you go in," she whispered, "I need to warn you. What we found, it's disturbing. If you want to back off, now's the time." Zeke and I gave each other looks. Though anxiety was chewing at my stomach, I knew we couldn't abandon this work incomplete. Zeke nodded in accord as I stated, "We'll do it." Booker, the detective, guided us indoors. Evidence markers now crowded the living room where we had worked yesterday. The little door leading to the crawl space opened to show a black passageway. "We have removed most of the items," Detective Booker said, "but we need you to do a thorough clean. Every surface, every nook and cranny. We can't risk leaving any evidence behind." "Detective, what precisely did you find in those hidden rooms?" I said as we suited up. She hesitated, then continued softly, "Evidence of multiple crimes. Murders, most likely. We're still trying to identify all the victims." My stomach whirled. After killings we had cleaned up before, this felt different, more terrible somehow. We set to work, first in the living room. The bloodstain that had returned yesterday vanished today and showed no indication of returning. But the sense of being watched came back, more potent than ever as we cleaned. I heard it once again when I was wiping the wall close to the crawl space. The whisper. It sounded to be emanating from the secret passageway. "Zeke!" I yelled, slightly trembling in voice. "Do you hear that?" His eyes widened as he nodded. Indeed, it comes from in there. Against better taste, I approached the crawl space. The whisper became louder, more clear-cut. It sounded to be labels, a name list repeated over and over. I felt a touch on my shoulder out of nowhere and almost leaped from my skin. "Detective Booker," came first. "Don't," she said with great conviction. "Don't go in there. We have had incidents involving persons who have ventured too far into those passages." Zeke inquired, "What kind of incidents?" The face of Detective Booker was austere. "Two of our officers went in to investigate last night. Only one came out. We are still looking for the other." A cold crawled along my back. This was what sort of venue? We carried on working, attempting to overlook the constant whispers. But odd events continued throughout the day. Tools would vanish, then seem in strange locations. Bloodstains we had cleansed were resurfaced at separate sites. And all the while, that muttering persisted, occasionally so faint it was hardly discernible, and other times strong enough to cause us to leap. By the time nightfall arrived, we were all tense. Normally so calm, Detective Booker also seemed disturbed. She remarked, scratching her temples, "I think that's enough for today. We shall continue tomorrow." I noted something strange about the wall close to the crawl area as we were packing. One that most certainly hadn't been there before appeared to be faintly visible as a door. I yelled, "Detective," pointing at the wall. "Do you view that?" Her brow wrinkled as she came over. "That is not possible." We looked over every inch of this place. Watching, the outline grew more clear. Then, to our surprise, the wall started to move and slid open to expose even another dark passageway. The muttering turned louder and more insistent. And we heard something more from the gloom beyond the fresh gateway. Steps, slow and deliberate, heading toward us. Not moving, we stood all there staring at the dark hole in the wall. The footsteps were approaching, resonating in the still hum. First to break out of it was Detective Booker, pulling out her gun and pointing it at the door. Strong, even though I could see she was terrified. "Phoenix PD! Who's there?" she cried. The steps ceased. Everything was silence for a little. Then somewhere in the darkness a voice emerged. Though it was faint and scratchy just above a whisper, we could all hear it clear. "So many names," replied it. "So many people. You want to join them?" My heart was pounding far too quickly. There is nothing real about this. It needed to be something like a horrible joke. Still carrying her gun, Detective Booker stepped forward. "Come out slow and raise your hands." I felt chilled all over when we heard laughter from the darkness. Then gradually someone emerged from the gateway. At least it looked like one, a man. He was tall and slender, dressed in a suit that might have been good but now was all ripped apart and filthy. His facial expression, I will not forget it ever. With eyes that seemed to gleam in the low light, it was quite pale, nearly white. Detective Booker probes, "Who are you? How did you land in here?" The man grinned, and his teeth seemed too sharp for ordinary use. "I have always been here," he said, listening and waiting in the dark places in the walls. Next to me, Zeke produced an odd noise. Though my feet would not move, I longed to run. Detective Booker stated, "You're under arrest," although her voice trembled somewhat. "Turn around and touch behind your back." The man's grin became wider. "Oh, I don't think so. You'll see, this is my house, my place, and you. You're not supposed to be here." He stepped forward, and I swear the shadows in the room moved with him. In the tiny space, Detective Booker's warning shot was quite loud. She shouted, "Stay back!" The man hardly jumped at all. He simply continued to grin, that terrifying one. "Your guns cannot injure me," he said. "Now, nothing can. I'm beyond that." I watched something quite terrifying as he spoke. All day long, the blood we had been cleaned was returning and lively spreading over the walls and floor. The whispers became louder, then surrounding us a chorus of voices. My voice truly hushed. I asked myself, "What do you want?" The man stared at me, and I thought I was slipping into his brilliant eyes. "What do I want?" he questioned once more. "I want what I have always wanted. More names for my collection, more people to hang on my walls." Everything suddenly got insane. Things flew from shelves, the furniture began to move, the whispers became screams, a terrifying concoction of grief and agony, and the man simply watched us with those shining eyes through it all. Detective Booker cried, "Run!" firing her gun at the man. There were no marks, the bullets seemed to pass right through him. There was no need for two tells. Running for the front door, we tried not to trip on the blood splatters all around or get struck by flying objects. Behind us, I could hear the man chuckling. This sound would cause long-standing unpleasant dreams for me. Trying to gather our breath, we rushed from the house. When they heard the shots, more cops outside rushed. Detective Booker instructed them right away to keep an eye on the residents and call for further assistance. Still breathing hard, we stood there, and I turned back toward the house. I could see shadows moving through the windows, bending in ways not possible. And there the man stood in the doorway. Before turning back inside, he lifted his hand and waved at us, almost as though he were playing. My head spun with confused ideas for the next 2 hours. Additional police arrived, and some men appeared to be from a special unit. When they entered the house, they came upon nothing, nor hidden rooms, nor strange men, not including the blood, vanished even. It felt as though nothing at all happened. Detective Booker erased everything we said, but I saw she was struggling to make sense of it all. How might she create a report on something so unable? They concluded ultimately that the matter remained unresolved. Called a crime scene, the house at 1837 West Missouri Avenue was closed off. But I knew, we all knew, that whatever was in that home could not be kept under any kind of control with police tape. 2 months separate that day from now. I leave aftermath specialists at work. I stopped visiting homes as I was always wondering what might be hiding in the walls. Zeke also quit. He relocated to another state, last I know, seeking to distance himself from Phoenix as best he could. Although Detective Booker is still on the force, I have heard tales that she is different. She reportedly spends all of her free time hunting for anything like what we observed by reviewing past cases. About that place, about the man with the brilliant eyes, I find myself thinking constantly. Though I live miles from West Missouri Avenue, occasionally late at night I feel whispering. And every time I pass a mirror or a dark window, I find myself looking twice, terrified I will see that pale face grinning back at me. Regarding that house, I'm not sure what really transpired. I doubt if we will ever grasp it. One fact, nevertheless, is that there are things in our planet that neither explainable nor non-existent, but yet exist. Sometimes, too, such things find us whether or not we are ready for them. Thus, do yourself a favor if you ever visit Phoenix and happen to drive down West Missouri Avenue. Don't stop at number 18-1937. Ignore it, not even looking at it, because you never know. It might glance backwards. I am a child psychologist in Idaho. Having worked in this field for almost 7 years, I felt I would have seen everything. But last month, something happened. It rocked me from inside out. I'm still trying to sort all of this. Monday morning was the starting point. I was in my workplace, at 1075 North Curtis Road. That was just another ordinary day, not very noteworthy. Mostly normal visits with children I had been seeing for some time. I had a few appointments booked. Dr. Zephyr, there's a woman here. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's insisting on seeing you. Says it's urgent. My receptionist, Autumn, buzzed me about 10 a.m. I grumbled. In the field of my employment, this was not unusual. Parents sometimes fretted over little things. Tell her I can fit her in for 15 minutes between visits. A few minutes later, a woman entered my workplace. She seemed worn out. Not only fatigued, but also worn out in a level that transcended mere physicality. Meadow was her name. She had a son called River. Sure, I am aware of hippie names. Hello, Idaho. Her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Zephyr, she whispered. I don't know what to do anymore. River, he's changed. I nodded and pointed her in the direction of a seat. Changed how, Mrs.? She sank into the chair. Meadow is fine. And it's hard to explain. He knows things he shouldn't know. He does actions not typical. I have past knowledge of this sort. Many times parents find it difficult to grasp their children's evolving brains. Can you offer me an example? I said. Meadow drew in a long breath. Last week, he told me my mother was going to die. He detailed a car accident. The next day, my mom called. She'd been in an accident, exactly like River described. She's okay, but how could he have known? Though I kept my face straight, I felt a cold go down my spine. Children often have vivid images, Meadow. It could be a coincidence. She gave a strong head shake. It's not just that. Horrible things a 6-year-old shouldn't even know about. He's been drawing. I said, may I see these pictures? Meadow dug a stack of papers from her bag. Looking at them, I felt my blood stop. The illustrations were upsetting, to put it least mildly. Meticulous sequences of violence, mishaps, natural disasters, all rendered with a child's sloppy hand, yet with disturbing degrees of detail. Meadow, I replied gingerly. Has River been exposed to any violent media recently? TV shows? Video games? She gave her head a shake. We're quite careful about what he's exposed to. We hardly even own a TV. I nodded, attempting to absorb this data. I would be better off meeting with River. Could you bring him in tomorrow? Meadow nodded, and we scheduled a meeting for the following day. I spent a lot of time at my desk staring at the sketches after she went. Something about them nagged at me, but I couldn't pin it down. Meadow carried River in the next day. With his large blue eyes and mop of curly brown hair, he was a little child for his age. He looked ordinary, quiet, but not especially so for a child encountering a new adult. Hi, River, I answered, grinning broadly. Your mother tells me you have been creating some fascinating images. Would you want to draw something for me? I am Dr. Zephyr. River nodded softly. He picked some paper and crayons and began drawing right away. I tried to chat him through while he worked. So, River, what kind of leisure activities appeal to you? Not glancing up from his sketch, he shrugged. I enjoy watching. Watch what? I inquired. Everything, he said in a straightforward manner. I looked at Meadow, seated in the corner. She wrinkled her hands on her lap, looking apprehensive. River dropped his crayon and handed me the sketch after around 10 minutes. When I saw that, my heart virtually stopped. It was a finely rendered vehicle crash sketch. One car overturned as two vehicles collided at an intersection. And there in the drawing's corner was a street sign. Curtis R&D, Trying to keep my voice calm, I responded, "River." "Then why did you draw this?" He gazed up at me, his blue eyes startlingly strong. "Because it's going to happen today." I got shivers running down my back. "What do you mean that is going to happen?" "I saw it," he stated just now. "Like I see lots of things." I watched Meadow, who had turned pale. "Has he done this before, predicted things?" She nodded very slowly. "The accident with my mother, and other things. Smaller things, but he's always right." I turned to River once more. "How do you view these things, River?" He again shrugged. "I just do. Sometimes they're happening now, sometimes they're going to happen later. When I close my eyes, I see things." I stayed in the session attempting to figure out River's experience. Was it a kind of increased intuition and too active imagination mixed with chance? Alternatively, something else entirely? I was advising, be careful on your way home. Maybe avoid Curtis Road as Meadow and River were headed out. Meadow nodded, a thank you visible. I sat at my desk staring at River's sketch after they departed. I kept having the impression that something quite unusual was going on. Autumn exploded into my office later that evening as I was getting ready to head home. "Dr. Zephyr, 2 cars. It's just like that boy's drawing. Curtis Road has had a terrible accident. My blood seemed to have frozen. There cannot be this happening. It needed to be a coincidence, but I couldn't stop thinking about River's brilliant blue eyes and his straightforward comments. I just see things." As I drove home that evening, veering off course to avoid the accident. Scene. The next 2 weeks were a haze of visits with River and long evenings spent investigating everything that could account for his talents. I asked colleagues, perused scholarly publications, even investigated some less established sources. Still, nothing seemed to quite fit what River could achieve. We did sketching exercises, word associations, even some basic meditation techniques modified for youngsters. I experimented with several approaches to grasp River's visions. River stayed calm and cooperative through it all, but also rather remote, as if he were just half present in the room with me. About 3 weeks after our first meeting, one session, I decided to try something different. I brought in a collection of old images depicting locations, people and events River would not have been able to possibly have seen. "River," I began, "I'm going to show you some pictures. I want you to tell me if you see anything when you look at them, okay?" He nodded, his huge blue eyes fixed on the box. I began one by one picking pictures. River merely shook his head for the first few. Then I showed him a picture of an ancient house, and he became very still. "This house is sad," he remarked gently. I asked, "Sad? What are you implying?" River's eyes appeared to wander somewhat without direction. "Bad things happened there, a long time ago. She's crying, a white-dressed lady." I got a cold running down my back. The picture featured the ancient Nampa house owned by my grandmother. My great-aunt had indeed passed away there in the 1950s. At the moment, she had been sporting her bridal gown. "River," I continued cautiously, "how do you know about the lady in the white dress?" He stared at me with shockingly direct eyes. "I told you, Dr. Zephyr, I see things." I showed River more pictures over an hour. Though he didn't react to all of them, his insights were shockingly accurate when he did. He related specifics of locations and events he could not have reasonably known. I spent a lot of time in my office attempting to sort out what had happened following the conference. Any traditional psychology theory failed to adequately explain River's talents. Seeing things that had happened long ago, he seemed to be able to somehow access the past of sights and items. That evening I found myself unable to relax. About River, about the things he had seen, I continued pondering. About 2 a.m., I got up and headed to my home office. I had carried the photo box home with me, and now I arranged them on my desk and stared at them as though they might some secret. My eyes strayed to a picture I hadn't seen River as I was browsing them. It was a scene of my former Oregon College campus. I felt obliged to bring it to our following session for some reason. River showed up for his regular visit the next week. He appeared somewhat withdrawn, quieter than normal. As he settled in, "Is everything okay, River?" I inquired. He nodded but did not look at me. "I saw something bad last night," he replied quietly. Leaning forward, worried was my inclination. "What did you perceive?" River began to pull as he spoke. There was a big building, lots of people. Someone was angry, very angry. His crayon glided across the paper more quickly. There was a loud noise then. Red, lots of red. He handed me the artwork as he was ending his speech. My blood ran cold. It was an undeveloped yet identifiable college campus sketch. The campus of my former college. And in the middle of the drawing there stood a figure clutching what appeared to be a rifle. "River," I continued, my voice trembling somewhat, "when is this going to happen?" He gazed up at me, his blue eyes tinged with the melancholy no 6-year-old ought to know. "Tomorrow," he remarked just now. I felt as though I was not breathing. This is not reality. It must have been accidental. Deeply down, though, I knew it wasn't. River's forecasts had been overly explicit and too accurate. Rising quickly, I remarked, "I have to make a call. Wait here with your mother, okay?" Leaving the office, I called the campus police from my previous college. As I said, I felt terrible explaining that I had cause to think there might be a shooting on campus the next day. Though dubious on the phone, the officer assured me they would boost patrols in case. River was seated silently, painting another image when I returned to the office. This one depicted someone wearing a police outfit, standing next to a building. The person had a broad smile on its face. "What's this, River?" I begged. He raised his head toward me and grinned for the first time since we had crossed paths. "It's good now," he remarked. "The terrible event won't happen." Though it was soon followed by a fresh sensation of anxiety, I felt a rush of relief sweep over me. If River was right, then his vision of the shooting had been real and now it had been blocked. What did that imply? Is one able to affect the future? If so, what accountability did that place on River? About me? I started wondering if I had done the right thing as River and his mother headed off that day. Had I stopped a disaster from happening? Alternatively, had I just started a fresh series of events that might result in something much worse? The next several days were quite trying. Constantly staring at the news, I was waiting for something terrible to happen, but nothing at all. Not shooting, not terrible behavior in my former institution. Though I ought to have been delighted, I became more concerned. Instead, what would that imply if River could truly see what would happen and if we could alter it? Thinking about that gave my head pain. When I spoke with River, I attempted to act normally, but it proved difficult. We persisted in trying to grasp his unique talent. But the more we worked, the more I came to see how hardly I understood it at all. About a month after the college event, River arrived looking somewhat exhausted one day. Meadow's mother was concerned as well. She replied, "He's been having bad dreams," as River settled in. "He wakes up screaming, raving about the dark thing." I pointed at River. "Can you tell me about this dark thing, River?" Looking terrified, he shook his head. "It's bad," he remarked very softly. "It's approaching." "What's coming, River?" I questioned tactically. He grabbed his crayons instead of responding and began drawing really quickly. He created a frightening picture. All of it was black scribbles, with what resembled dark red eyeballs. and in the corner I recognized the form of the Idaho State Capitol building. Trying to project calm, "River," I asked, "is this dark thing going to do something at the Capitol?" He nodded while still in drawing. He declared, "It's hungry. It wants to eat everything." I started to get very afraid. "When is this likely to happen, River?" Tears welling in his eyes, he stared at me. "Soon," he said. "Realistically soon." I spent a lot of time sitting in my office staring at River's drawing until he departed, though I knew I ought to inform someone who would believe. Me? How could I put this without coming out as insane? At last, I chose to give an old friend employed by the state government a call. I told him merely that I heard something horrible would happen in the Capitol. I did not tell him everything. "Actually," he added, "we've had some weird stuff happening lately. Lights not working right, strange noises. Some of the night guards have been quitting, saying they feel like someone's watching them." Hearing it made me terribly afraid. "Listen," I replied, "I can't explain how I know this, but I think something bad is going to happen there. Soon. Can you make the place safer? Maybe look around the building really good?" He said, "Fine." After I hung up, I felt a little better. Still, I felt somewhat concerned when I reviewed River's sketch once again. The next several days proved challenging. Always looking for something to happen, I kept reading the news. River visited me more, but he spoke hardly. He merely sat there and sketched many images of the dark thing. Then it happened one Wednesday night. Watching the local news at home, I heard something about the state capitol. They said hardly more than that something strange happened there. Right away, I phoned my Capitol friend. He sounded truly afraid. "Zephyr," he began, "I don't know how to explain what happened. Everything was normal then. It was like the dark came alive. Guards said they seen things moving in the shadows, heard whispers, and then all just stopped. I listened, my heart hammering fiercely. I inquired, 'Did anyone get hurt?' 'No,' he answered with a perplexed tone. 'That's the weird thing, nothing. Broke. Nobody got hurt. It's like whatever it was. It just left.' I sat in my living room for a long time trying to figure out what happened after I hung up. Did River's vision come to pass? And if it did, what specifically occurred at the Capitol? I saw River the following day in a conference. He seemed, when he first arrived, diverse, calmed somehow, more loosened. 'The dark thing is gone,' he remarked as soon as he took a seat. I questioned, 'Gone? What do you mean, River?' He threw a shrug. 'It was hungry, but it found someone else to eat somewhere far away.' I felt both delighted and concerned. 'River,' I continued deliberately, 'do you know where it went?' He gave his head a shake. 'No, but it's good, right? That's not here anymore.' I nodded, not sure what to say. Was that decent? Did we truly avert something terrible from happening? Alternatively, did we simply move it somewhere else where others would suffer? I became considering River's unique abilities as he went with his mother. Might he merely see what is about to happen, or might he bring things about too? And just how much could he accomplish if he could bring things about? The weeks after that seemed to bring things back to normal. River lacked as many visions, and their horror wasn't as great. He began discussing typical childhood events, like school buddies' favorite toys, while another part questioned whether this was merely prelude to yet another major crisis. Part of me was delighted about this. I have been working with River, attempting to help him grasp and regulate his unique gift. Actually, though, I'm not particularly sure what I'm doing. I cannot find a book that will enable me to grasp his capabilities. Occasionally, when I'm by myself at my office, I gaze at every drawing River created. I consider all he has observed as well as all he might see going forward. I also question whether I'm truly helping him, or whether I'm only allowing something we do not comprehend pass through. What next is unknown to me. I'm not sure whether River will have more visions or whether the dark thing will resurface. My life has permanently changed, nevertheless, and things I cannot understand and events that challenge all I understood about the world make me doubt everything. That is thus my narrative. Currently working in Boise, Idaho, I am a child psychologist. River shows up every week still. Now, though, every time I gaze into his wide blue eyes, I wonder, what does he see when he stares at me? And ahead of him, what will he see? I guide cave trips at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. Having worked at this for around 5 years, I felt I understood every inch of these caverns. However, what occurred last month? It has caused me to doubt all I know about this land. It was Tuesday morning, same as every other Tuesday. About 7 a.m., I arrived at the visitor center at 260 Mammoth Cave Parkway to get ready for the daily excursions. 20 individuals in all were booked for the initial trip at 9 a.m. Families, couples, and a small number of lone visitors mixed together. I delivered my regular safety lecture as we assembled at the cave entrance. All right, folks, stay with the group, watch your step, and don't touch anything unless I say it's okay. Any questions? We are about to enter one of the longest cave systems in the world. Perhaps 10 or 11, a small girl lifted her hand. Are the cave home any monsters? I nodded.
Just some bats and maybe a few cave crickets, no monsters here.
Just knowing how mistaken I was would help. As we descended inside the cave, everything first appeared to be normal. I answered questions, discussed the background of the cave, and highlighted fascinating rock formations. We arrived at the Grand Canyon of Mammoth Cave around an hour into the excursion. I said, "This chamber is about 40 feet high and 60 feet wide. An underground river over millions of years sculpted it." I spotted something strange as I was speaking. I had never seen before a little hole in the wall. It was roughly the scale of a doorway, half concealed by a big stalagmite. "That's strange," I said, more to myself than the others. One of the visitors, a man called Flint, questioned, "What's strange?" I held back. Though I couldn't ignore this, I wanted not to scare people. "Everyone, please stay here and do not move. There is an opening here that I do not recall seeing before. It is most likely nothing." Approaching the entrance warily, I pointed my spotlight into the night beyond. It seems to produce a limited pathway. Peering inside, I felt a chilly air over my face. That's strange. In caverns, air currents are typical, this felt. Different somehow. Another visitor, a woman nicknamed Willow, said, "What do you see?" "It looks like yet another passageway," I said. I have no idea where it points. Searching for direction, I turned back toward the gathering. Although we were intended to follow the planned tour path, my curiosity was overriding all else. "All right, everyone," I decided. "Stay close behind me. Remember, don't touch anything. We're going to take a little detour." We moved into the single-file-tight passageway. As we descended, the air grew cooler. I could hear water dropping some distance away. About 50 feet later, the tube opened out into a little chamber. And at that point, things began to seem strange. About 30 feet broad, the chamber was fairly circular. Still, I was drawn to the wall marks. Though unlike anything I have ever seen, they resembled cave art. Odd symbols and figures that appeared to change and migrate under our headlights. "Wow," Flint said. "Are these paints by Native Americans?" I gave a slow head shake. I doubt so. I have never seen anything like this before." Examining the artwork, I also observed something else. A little puddle of water sat in the middle of the chamber. Like a mirror reflecting the cave ceiling, it was absolutely still. but closer inspection revealed something was amiss. The reflection ran counter to the ceiling above. Rather, it displayed a starry sky as though the pool served as a window to the evening outdoors. Trying to keep my voice cool, "Everyone, stay back from the water," I said. "Never touch it." But it was already too late. The young child who earlier asked about monsters had already touched the surface of the water. Her finger broke the surface and the chamber started to hum quietly. The water started to ruckle. "What's happening?" someone yelled. "I wish I knew something." The humming got louder, and the figures in the paintings on the walls seemed to move and dance in a dizzying exhibition. My heart thumping, I said, "We have to leave. Today." The passageway vanished as we turned to return the way we had come. There, it had been now solid rock. We were stuck. Starting to set in was panic. People were screaming, yelling, asking to know what was happening. Though I tried to cool them off, I felt exactly as afraid as they did. It is at this point we heard it. One hears something emanating from the pool. It seemed like singing. But unlike all the singing I have ever heard, in a language I cannot identify, it was both beautiful and terrible at once. And then from the sea, something started to show up. It first resembled a hand extending from the pool, but we came to see it was not human as it ascended. Long and thin, it had too many joints and finished in pointed, claw-like fingers. As more of the creature materialized, the singing got louder. Shouting, "Everyone, get back!" I pushed them into the chamber's walls. The creature emerging from the water defied all I had ever seen. At least 7 feet tall, it appeared to be not quite solid, with a body that seemed to shimmer and change. Its head was elongated, and its dark big eyes mirrored our spotlight's light. Everything stopped for a second. The monster stood there, glistening with apparently softly glowing water. It then spoke. The words were unlike any language I had ever heard. They were a sequence of clicks and whistles that somehow made sense virtually. Stranger still, I knew I could grasp it. "You have awakened us," whispered its voice, ringing in my head instead of my ears. "You have called us back after eons of sleep." I moved forward, attempting to retain a steady voice. "Who? What are you?" The head of the monster slanted to one side and studied me. "We are the Guardians. We have watched over this place since before your kind walked the earth." Axel, one of the visitors, shoved ahead. "This is kind of joke, right? Some new attraction for the cave tours?" The beast turned its eye to Axel, who went still with pale face right away. "This is no deception," the Guardian said. "We have been awakened because the balance is shifting. The old ways are returning." Although I didn't know what that meant, I knew we were much over our means. "Look," I advised, "we'll leave and never come back. Just show us the way out. We didn't mean to disturb you." The Guardian produced what might have been laughter. "You have seen, and now you must decide it is too late for that." Fearing the response, I said, "Choose what?" "To forget or to see," the newspaper said. "Those who choose to forget will return to their lives without memory of this place. Those who choose to see will be given knowledge beyond their imagining, but they can never return to the world they knew." A murmur circulated among the assembly. A few were crying, others seemed perplexed or irritated. I was at a loss for action. There was nothing in any tour guide instruction I have ever received covering this. "You can't simply keep us here," I responded, attempting to seem braver than I felt. "People will be arriving looking for us." The Guardian gestured, and the wall where the passageway had been shimmered and opened out right away. The main chamber of the cave was visible to us, and another tour group was passing through totally ignorant of our existence. Time moves differently here, the Guardian clarified. Only moments have passed in your world. You have until the moon rises to choose.
The Guardian dropped back into the pool with that, leaving us in the room by ourselves.
The following several hours were disorganization. People debated, wept, prayed. Some choose to go back to their regular lives and forget. Others asked about the information the Guardian provided. Like Axel, some felt this was all some complex prank and refused to make any decisions at all. Though the truth was that I was exactly as disoriented as they were, I tried to keep everyone cool. My life outside the cave kept me thinking. My job, my family, my pals, could I truly give all that up for some yet unidentified knowledge? Again, though, could I return to my regular life knowing what I now knew, even if I couldn't recall the specifics? People began choosing as the hours went by. One of the first people to decide to see was Willow, the woman who had inquired about what I observed in the passageways. I've always felt like the world held more than what we know, she remarked. I could not turn down this opportunity. Flint decided to ignore it, on the other hand. I have a family, he added. I can't leave them behind. The tiny child who had touched the water was sobbing and clutching her parents. As a family, they decided to forget and held each other through that process. Individuals choose one at a time, some to remember, some to see. Every decision the person would either drop to the ground unconscious or vanish in a burst of light. At last, Axel and I were leaving. Though he insisted this was all fictitious, I could see the terror in his eyes. Axel, I replied, we have to choose. The moon will be rising shortly. I know this is hard to believe. His face white, he stared at me. How can you be so serene about this? This is crazy. I gave my head a shake. I'm not calm. I'm terrified. But we have to decide. We have no choice. The Guardian surfaced once more as if on demand from the pool. The time has come, remarked it. What are your preferences? Axel stared at the Guardian, then at me. At last, he closed his eyes. His voice hardly a whisper, he added, I choose to forget. Axel fell to the ground unconscious, but breathing steadily as there was a flash of light. It now was simply me and the Guardian. It looked at me uneasily. And you, guide of the caves? What is your choice? I inhaled deeply, considered all I had seen and all I had learned. I considered my life outside, my family, my work, and I considered the amazing, horrible universe this chamber had exposed to me. My heart thumping. I choose. I started. I choose to see, I murmured, my voice remarkably firm. The Guardian nodded. Its peculiar eyes seemed to glance right through me. A brave choice, it muttered. Are you ready for what it indicates? Though I'm not sure if I was, I nodded nevertheless. One of the long, unusual hands of the Guardian extended toward my forehead. My mind erupted in visions, information, understanding right away. Like attempting to sip from a fire hose, it was overwhelming. I witnessed reality outside our own, the history of the earth, the secrets of the universe. I observed societies and species that had emerged and collapsed long before humans set foot on the planet. I observed the actual character of time and space, the interdependence of all objects. When it ended, I collapsed gasping from my knees. Standing over me, the Guardian's form seemed to move and change as I gazed at it from fresh angles. You have seen, stated it. Now you have to guard. Guard what? I said, still whirling in head from the flood of information. The balance, the Guardian answered. The doorways between worlds. The secrets that must remain hidden. Looking about the room, I saw it now for what it really was. a nexus point where reality crossed with each other, not just a cave. The pool was a doorway as much as it was water. Living, telling tales of other planets and periods, the paintings on the walls were, what about the others? I wondered, considering the visitors who had opted for forgetfulness. The Guardian reported, they will awaken in the main chamber with no memory of this place. Their lives will proceed as be before. I nodded, a twinge of grief for the life I was bidding farewell. And those who opted to see? The Guardian said, they have been dispatched to other nexus points around your planet. They will guard and guide much as you will. The Guardian then showed me how to balance worlds, how to close the chamber, how to guide lost people who might come upon it. Though it was a lot to learn with my fresh perspective, everything made an odd sense. Turning to me one more time as the Guardian got ready to go back into the water, using my name for the first time, remember, Soren, it advised, with great knowledge comes great responsibility. Guard well. It was gone with that, leaving the chamber empty. The next few days, or were they several weeks? Time moved peculiarly here, a haze of learning and adaptation. Investigating the secret passageways of the cave system, I found horrors and wonders beyond human comprehension. I learnt to use the pool to view other times and locations, to interact with other Guardians worldwide. Lost visitors occasionally would make their way to the room. They would be allowed to see or to forget, just as my tour group would be. Most decided to forget, going back to their lives maybe with a vague awareness that they had gone through something significant, but unable to recall the particulars. Still, occasionally someone would want to see. Those were the toughest, seeing the astonishment and wonder on their faces as they acquired the news. One knew their life would never be the same. Regarding myself, I grew used to my new position. It was not easy. There were times when I sorely missed my former life and yearned for the simplicity of running cave tours and returning home to watch TV. I could not, however, ignore the amazing quality of what I had been handed or the significance of the work I had been assigned. I spotted a familiar face one day watching the pool. One of the visitors from my group, Willow, had decided to visit. She was guarding a portal buried deep in the Amazon rainforest at another junction point. Although we couldn't talk straightforwardly, seeing her calmed me. I was not in this weird new world by myself. Years went by while I hardly aged in the everlasting chamber. Through the pool, I witnessed civilizations build and fall, watched as people pushed farther into space. The world changed. And I kept the secrets of the cave under protection, balancing worlds throughout. Sometimes late at night, though day and night had little significance in the perpetual twilight of the cave, I would find myself remembering that fatal trip. I would recall the faces of the visitors and wonder what had happened to those who had decided to forget. Have they ever dreamed strangely of a secret chamber? Could they not quite recollect something they felt they had lost? And I'd consider my decision. Had I chosen the correct course forward? There were moments when I questioned myself, and when the weight of the knowledge I possessed seemed intolerable. Then I would gaze into the water, see the grandeur of the cosmos open out before me, and realize that, for all its difficulties, I would not alter my decision. Here I am now, still in Mammoth Cave, but in an area that never will ever be seen on a conventional tour. I am now a guardian, a keeper of secrets, a defender of the equilibrium between worlds, not only a guide. Should you be reading this, you could be asking whether it is all accurate. Perhaps you visited Mammoth Cave, underwent one of the excursions, and everything appeared to be in order. Perhaps you are considering this as merely the wild narrative of someone with an overly active imagination. But take notice the next time you visit a cave, any dark, silent space. Pay Close attention. You may get a whisper and sense an odd breeze. And keep in mind my narrative should you do. Recall that this planet is more than what first greets the surface. And consider carefully whether you ever find yourself in a secret chamber having to decide whether to see or forget. Once you decide to see, you cannot undo it. The planet won't appear the same evermore, but my, what a planet we live on. Hello there. Working as a night security guard at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, goes Briar. Curious? It's at 161 Essex Street. Having worked in this field for over 3 years, I felt I would have seen everything. But last month, what transpired? It has transformed all I knew about this place. Starting from the beginning, it was Tuesday night, or I suppose Wednesday morning, roughly at 2 a.m. Doing my regular rounds, I checked every display to make sure everything was secure. As it is at that hour of night, the museum was still. Just the sound of my feet resonating over the hallways. I heard something after just finishing looking over the maritime exhibit and was moving toward the Asian art collection. Though in the quiet of the museum it was faint, hardly discernible, sounding like, speaking softly. I first considered perhaps it was only the wind. The museum is housed in an old structure that occasionally sounds unusual. But the cacophony grew louder as I neared the Asian art show. Not the wind, it was not that. It was most certainly whispering. I reached for my flashlight and shined it about the space. I shouted, "Hello, is anyone here?" Not an answer, yet the muttering persisted. It seemed to emanate from one of the exhibit cabinets. My heart thumping in my chest, I went gently toward it. The container included an old Japanese no mask, the sort used in conventional theater. It was a white, delicate, feature-painted woman's face. The whispering got louder as I neared. Though I couldn't see any words, it sounded nearly begging, frantic. I then swear, I watched the mask move. It was simply a small, almost perceptible twitch. But I observed the mask part's lips slightly opening in the glare of my flashlight, as though it were communicating. I staggered backward, almost dropping my flashlight. There is no such happening here. Masks not move. They hardly whisper. I have to be more exhausted than I realized. I chose to radio Thorn, a colleague who watched the security cameras. "Hey Thorn," I said, attempting to keep a calm voice. "Can you find the Asian art exhibit on the camera? I thought I saw something move." There was a stop. Then Thorn's voice burst across the radio. "Checking now, Briar. Every view on the cameras appears normal. What did you think you saw?" I slowed down. How would I explain that I believed I heard a mask whispering? I said at last, "It's probably nothing. Just my eyes running tricks on MME. Want me to come down there?" Thorn inquired. "No, it's good," I answered. "I'll sweep again, then return to the security office." Half expecting the mask to be gone, I turned back to face the exhibit case. Still there, though, it appeared as dead as it always did. The murmurs had stopped. Long still, I watched the mask and waited for something to happen, but nothing happened. I shook my head at last and went on my rounds. I have to have imagined all. Many late evenings and too much coffee. That has to be the answer. Still, I felt as I turned away that something was staring at me. I kept peering beyond my shoulder, hoping to see. What I know is nothing. The hallway stayed empty and quiet, though. Thorn turned from the monitors when I returned to the security office. "Everything okay?" he questioned. I nodded, attempting to show more confidence than I felt. Like I stated, merely my eyes are fooling me here. All good. Though Thorn nodded, I could tell he didn't really believe me. "You know," he added gently, There are stories about this place. Old stories. I looked up an eyebrow. What sort of narratives? Thorne slanted back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the displays. Sometimes that history doesn't want to stay in the past. They say some of the artifacts here, they're not just objects. I got a cold running down my spine. What did you mean? He sighed. Just stories, probably nothing to them, but some of the old-timers say they have seen things, heard things, especially at night. Though I thought of the whispering mask, I said nothing. Thorne shouldn't be thinking I'm losing it. The night went without incident, the remainder of it. At 6 a.m, my shift finished and I was more than ready to head home and nap. But I kept looking at the Asian art display as I was leaving. Still there, quiet and unmoving, the mask was. Still, it seemed, somehow, various, like it was waiting for something. Driving home, I attempted to ignore the sensation. I told myself, just my imagination running wild. Not anything else than that. But that night, I kept seeing the mask in my dreams as I tried to fall asleep. And in my dreams, it was not quiet. It cried out. The next several evenings passed silently, nearly too silent. During my rounds, I was on edge and jumped at every slight sound. The Asian art show seemed particularly spooky, but the mask stayed motionless and quiet. I started to consider perhaps that I had dreamt everything. But then something else happened 1 week following the mask incident. I heard music as I was looking over the American art collection. Though it was faint and seemed to be from far away, I could definitely identify the tune. It sounded like an ancient folk tune, the sort you might find at a county fair 100 years before. I trailed the music, my flashlight beam moving over sculptures and paintings. The music drove me to a painting I had seen 100 times before but never really gave any thought. People in traditional attire whirled about a barn in a rural dance scenario. The music grew louder as I neared the artwork. Then I observed something that made my blood stop cold. The figures in the painting moved. Though virtually undetectably slow, they were certainly moving to the beat I could hear. Sure, I must be seeing things. I massaged my eyes. Looking once more, though, the movement persisted. One of the figures, a red-dressed woman, seemed to turn and glance directly at me. Her painted eyes locked with mine, and I had a shock of object, anxiety, acknowledgements I was not sure. Heart thumping, I turned away from the painting. There is nothing real about this. Paintings never move. They create not music, but rather I couldn't, however, discount what I was seeing and hearing. I went for my radio and stumbled. "Thorne," I murmured, my voice faltering. "I want you down in the American Art Gallery now." "On my way," Thorne said, sounding worried. "What is happening, Briar? How could I have explained it?" Just hurry," I replied. I watched the painting as I waited for Thorne. The figures kept their silent dance while soothing background music played. The red-dressed woman remained staring at me, her painted eyes seeming to beg for something. Arriving a few minutes later, Thorne was slightly breathless. Looking about the museum, he questioned, "What's wrong?" I gestured towards the painting. "Look," I said. "Tell me you see it also." Thorne stared at the picture, squinting. "See what?" "Briar, it's only a painting." I turned to study him, then returned to face the artwork. The numbers were still. The sound of the music stopped. Everything just as it ought to be. But they were moving, I murmured faintly. Some music. Thorne laid a hand on my shoulder. "Briar, maybe you should break off to get some coffee or something." I gave my head a shake. "I know what I've seen. I'm not insane, Thorne."
He sighed after a protracted glance at me.
"Look, I believe you think you saw something, but there's nothing moving in that painting. Maybe you're just tired. It happens sometimes, all of us. I wanted to debate, to help him to grasp. Still, I knew how it sounded. I thus nodded and allowed him guide me back to the security office. I sat in the office monitoring the monitors all evening. Nothing out of the ordinary transpired. The image stayed stationary. The masks spoke not in whispers. Everything was in line. Still, I felt as though something was quite wrong. I arrived early at work the following evening. Before my shift began, I wanted to visit the picture under daylight. Perhaps I might glimpse something I overlooked in darkness. When I arrived, the gallery was packed with people. Trying to look laid back, I headed for the painting. It resembled exactly what it had always looked like. No movement, no music, simply a still scene featuring a country dance. I felt someone approach me as I stood there, fixed on the image. This was an elderly woman with white hair nicely put up, eyes brilliant behind her glasses. Nodding at the painting, she added, "Beautiful, isn't it?" I was unsure what to say, her voice lowering conspiratorially. "You know," she said, "they say this painting has a secret." I turned to focus on her. "A secret?" She grinned, her eyes widening in wrinkles. "Oh, sure. They say that occasionally, if you look at it just right, you can see the people dancing. And if you listen very carefully, you might even hear the music." I got shivers running down my back. Had you ever seen Eerie?" said. The smile of the elderly woman darkened somewhat. "Once," she added. "A long time ago. I was just a girl. I came here on a school trip and I wandered away from my group. I found myself in front of this painting and, well, I saw things I couldn't explain. Pushing, my heart pounding. What kind of things?" She stared at me, her eyes piercing just then. "Things that shouldn't be possible," she declared. "Events that caused me to doubt all I knew about the world." A group of visitors arrived in the gallery, their conversation shattering the stillness before I could ask any more inquiries. The elderly woman vanished from sight as I turned back into the throng. The rest of the day I considered what she had mentioned. Was it conceivable that other people had seen the artwork move as well? If so, what implied this? I felt something was going to happen as my shift began that evening. Anything major, and I was correct, but not in the manner I had anticipated. Since that was the evening things turned around. The evening that passed came alive, and the boundary separating reality from impossibility vanished permanently. My change began in conventional enough fashion. I looked at every exhibit carefully as usual, doing my checks. I halted before the painting when I arrived to the American Art Museum. Still, it was not moving as before. Still, it felt somewhat like it was awaiting something. A strange sensation emerged as the evening wore on. Though it was difficult to articulate, the museum seemed to be holding its breath overall. Even Thorne observed. On the radio about midnight, he inquired, "Does something feel weird to you?" "Yeah," I said, delighted I wasn't the only one experiencing it. "Like something's going to happen." Thorne said, "Keep your eyes open and be cautious." It started about 2 a.m. Hearing that, I was in the boat display. Music emanating from many directions concurrently. Not just the ancient tune I listened to, but also many other sounds. Big music from the European rooms, African show drums, Asian art section flutes. I fled room to room, my illumination bouncing off objects and walls. Unbelievably difficult things were happening everywhere I turned. Paintings were alive, their people moving and speaking. As I passed, statues turned to face me. Even the stuffed animals in the section on nature appeared to be breathing. The mask at the Asia art display was whispering quickly in Japanese from its cabinet. A mummy was gently opening itself in the Egypt Museum, sand spilling across the floor. When I tried to radio Thorn, I just got noise. I went by myself. I spotted her while I stood in the midst of the large hall surrounded by the unreachable. The woman in the red outfit taken from the painting, perched at the top of the stairs, she was gazing down at me. She also was as real as I was. Her voice resounding through the hall, she said, "Help us. Please, you gotta help us." With shaking in my voice. "Help you how?" I said, "What's occurring?" Her red dress swirled over her feet as she descended the steps. "We are caught," she remarked. "All of us, stuck between worlds. And tonight we have chance to get free. But we need your help." I nodded, trying to grasp. "How can I help?" "I don't get it." She stretched forward to grab my hand. Her touch was real yet frigid. "You see us!" she exclaimed. "You hear us? That makes you a bridge. You can help us cross over." "Cross over where?" I asked. Speaking from the opposite side, she said, "We have been stuck here for so long, can't move on. But you can set us free." Other figures materialized as she spoke. Even ancient objects moved by some inexplicable power. The people from paintings and sculptures come to life. They all fixed me with pleading looks. "Please," the red-clad woman then asked, "will you assist us?" I peered about at the gathering of unreal possibilities. This is not reality. It must be a dream. Perhaps I was seeing things. However, it felt real. It felt accurate in a manner I couldn't articulate. I said, "What do I need to do?" The woman grinned, radiating great pleasure. "Just open the door," she advised. Until now, the door that has always been here but that nobody could see. She walked me to the main hall's blank wall. Getting close, I started to see something show up. An elegant, old-looking door with strange symbols etched on it. The woman asked, "Open it." I stretched out, my hand trembling. My fingertips on the door handle set off a great surge of energy. The door opened, producing a brilliant white light. Red-clad woman grasped my hand. She said, "Thank you," in whispers. She then sank into the light. The other people trailed one by one. Old objects rested back in their cases. Paintings became vacant. Sculptures returned to their places. The whispering vanished. The music ceased. At last, I was by myself in the peaceful museum, staring at a blank wall where the door had been. I stood there for what length of time? Minutes or hours would have been possible. At last, though, I heard Thorn's radio voice sounded terrified. "Where are you, Briar? Do you hear me?" With still trembling hands, I raised the radio to my mouth. I said, "I'm here, in the main hall right now." A few minutes later, Thorn located me. "What happened?" He queries. "The cameras went out for hours. I couldn't get you on the radio." I stared at him, then turned to survey the museum. Everything was once more in line. Not any indication of the impossible things I had seen. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said. Thorn stared at my face for a protracted period. "Try me," he said. I then informed him all about the shifting paintings, the muttering mask, the red-dressed woman, the door to wherever they had all disappeared to. Unbelievably, Thorn listened without halting me. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. "You know," he finally remarked, "I've worked here for 20 years. And in all that time, I've never seen anything I could not explain. But I've heard stories like yours." With hardly daring to hope, I murmured, "You believe me?" Thorn nodded. "I believe you believe it. And honestly, that's enough for me. This place, it's old. It's full of history. Who's to say some of that history isn't stickable?" We checked the museum all night, but everything was in order. We said nothing about what had transpired when folks showed up for the day. How would we characterize it? Events have been calm in the weeks after that evening. The mask doesn't whisper, the paintings are still. Sometimes, though, I feel as though I'm under observation when writing my checks. Like the old things are waiting, bidding their time. And occasionally, early in the morning, I believe I can hear music. Faint and far away, yet there. Remind us that this planet is more than what first greets us. I still am employed with the museum. If I wanted to, I doubt I could go now. I sense myself strangely linked to its mysteries in a way I cannot quite articulate. That might be me if you ever visit the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem and observe a night guard staring somewhat too carefully at the artworks or pausing a little too long in front of a display case. Additionally, who knows, perhaps you will spot something too. Now I realize that the true stories come to life at this museum after the lights go down and the guests leave for home.